Thank you everyone for coming to the first webinar of our three-part webinar series. We are in the first session called Uncovering the Costs of Academic Data Sharing, from Real Data to Tips for Future Planning with ARL and DCN. Our speakers today are Shawna Taylor, Project Manager of Open Science at the Association of Research Libraries, Wendy Kozlowski, who's Director of Research Data and Open Scholarship at the Cornell University Library, Alicia, I'm sorry, how do I pronounce your last name?
Hofelich Mohr.
Hofelich Mohr, who's the Data Management Research Associate in the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Minnesota, and Mikala Narlock, who's Director of the Data Curation Network. This session will include representation from ARL and DCN, which I will describe next. So the Association of Research Libraries, or ARL, is a nonprofit membership organization of research libraries and archives in major public and private universities, federal government agencies, and large public institutions in Canada and the US. Now, Data Curation Network, which is based at the University of Minnesota, is a membership organization of institutional and non-profit data repositories whose vision is to advance open research by making data more ethical, reusable, and understandable. All of the presenters today are DCN members, and we look forward to what they have to say. So I will go ahead and hand over control.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Peace. So first off, hello. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Uncovering the Costs of Academic Data Sharing, from Real Data to Tips for Future Planning with ARL, Association of Research Libraries, and the Data Curation Network, or DCN. So Peace graciously introduced us. Next slide, please, Mikala. But before we dig in to today's webinar, I wanted to mention that this work was made possible thanks to funding from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and the National Science Foundation. Next slide. I would also like to mention that there are 4 of us here today, but there are quite a few of us who are or have been part of this project. So the bolded names are the folks who are currently part of phase 2 of the Realities of Academic Data Sharing Project, or RADS project, as you'll hear us call it. Okay, next slide. So today we hope you'll walk away from the session with a few key ideas when working with researchers on data management and sharing activities, specifically when providing data management and sharing budget guidance. So first, we're going to highlight the 33 data sharing actions from our list of data management sharing, or just DMS activities, which occur across the entire research lifecycle. So Alicia is dropping the link to our latest version of those activities into the chat now, and that's also the document that was linked out in this webinar description. So hopefully this list will help you and your researchers articulate activities that are often overlooked when budgeting for DMS and grants. So then second goal for today is to understand real DMS expenses from NIH researchers. So this includes recognizing why some researchers budget $0 for DMS under the new NIH policy, and also examining detailed DMS costs from real grants based on award size and the number of activities. So this information is pulled from our project team's data sharing expense report released earlier this year, and Alicia is also putting a link to that report in the chat. And so finally, learn tips for future DMS planning. This we'll hear from Mikala Narlock to understand how Data Curation Network members use the DMS activities and the expense information to improve institutional practices and to support researchers. Then Alicia and Wendy will discuss strategies to identify potential DMS costs when consulting with researchers and how to build institutional support for DMS into researchers' projects, including training lab managers and designated DMS point person. So very briefly, a bit of background about this project, the Realities of Academic Data Sharing, or RAS initiative. It's based out of the Association of Research Libraries. And during our first phase of work, which was from 2021 to 2023, we conducted research across 6 universities. So those are Cornell, Duke, the University of Michigan, the University of Minnesota, Virginia Tech, and Washington University in St. Louis. This was a mixed method study that recruited both administrators of institutional units who support or supported data management and sharing services, as well as researchers who completed an NIH, an NSF, or a Department of Energy DOE funded research project in the last 10 years. So approximately the time these agencies started to have broader data sharing requirements, largely and thanks to the Holdren memo. So we use surveys and interviews to ask about the data management and sharing activities that are supported by administrators or done by researchers and their teams. We also asked about the costs, both in terms of personnel labor and infrastructure costs. So the data that we share in today's presentation are from these RADS Phase 1 surveys and interviews. All right, so it's worth noting that these reported practices and expenses were collected just before the NIH policy for DMS went into effect in January 2023. The new NIH policy aims to streamline and improve data sharing while also asking researchers to budget for DMS specifically, and I'm sure most folks, everybody on this call knows that. Our research shows that even before this policy took effect, DMS was being done by NIH researchers, and these activities had a cost. Even if that cost was not budgeted for, or even if the actions being done during the research lifecycle were not recognized by the researchers as actually data management and sharing activities. So how will data from our study pre the 2023 NIH data sharing policy help inform practices today? Well, first, we believe that our DMS activities lists are quite robust, and Wendy will discuss a bit more in detail about how they came into fruition and how you can use them. These activities can also act as an aid for researchers to suss out allowable costs under the new policy. So for example, curating data is listed as an allowable cost. But what does curation entail exactly? That can mean a number of things and can have a number of sub-activities. These activities may also help researchers understand what constitutes an unallowable cost. What is routine for one researcher may not be the case for another, and also this can vary from project to project, as I'm sure all of you know. So as part of our RADS Phase 2 work, which we're currently working through, we are prospectively following researchers awarded after implementation of the 2023 NIH DMS policy. So by meeting with the same researchers over the course of their grant, we are planning on doing that over the next 2 years or so, but we know that at the start of their grant, some have budgeting $0 for DMS. And we know that $0 for DMS is not correct, or at least largely not correct. Our Phase 1 research, which as Alicia will show, includes pre and post award expenses that admittedly could not be budgeted for by researchers. But our data shows that expenses for DMS are incurred across the project lifecycle. And although many activities are done in the planning or pre-award phase, most of them are not. And these activities should be budgeted for. And we know that in today's research environment, doing good science now requires data sharing. So why is the $0 DMS budget happening? So from our interviews with researchers, both in our first phase and our current phase, we typically have come across 2 themes that we believe are driving the $0 budget. So for some researchers, first for some, they may have been taught to incorporate DMS into their scientific practice, or have already modified their practice to include good data management and sharing behavior. They see data sharing as part of their routine research and may have difficulty extrapolating what can and should be budgeted for versus what is routine for them. On the other hand, for some researchers, DMS is something new or newer to consider. They might feel that data management and sharing is supplemental to their scientific practice, a burdensome add-on to doing science, But we know that this isn't the case, as some DMS activities, such as creating robust documentation for data reuse, often overlapped heavily with creating documentation for reproducibility, a gold standard of good scientific practice. So in either situation, it is important to note that data management and sharing is good science. And just as other aspects of good scientific practice are funded and valued, so should DMS. Budgeting for DMS does not take away from the research itself, and it should be considered part of the research. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wendy.
Thanks, Shawna. So speaking of budgeting and putting items into line items on budgets, we felt that we really needed to have a place to start that conversation. And in order to do that, we needed to be sure that we had a vocabulary or we're using words that researchers understood when we talked about the actions that they're taking to create public access science or public access outputs. So if you take, for example, vocabularies can be very confusing. So if you take, for example, the idea or the concept of coding, if you were to approach a researcher and ask if they use coding, Mikala, go ahead and advance the slide by one. If you were to ask someone if they use coding in their work, what answer do you think they might give you? If I am talking to an ecologist, for example, I'll even put myself in these shoes. The first thing I go to when I think of coding is I think of a scripting language that I use for data processing, for pulling information, for creating images or figures. However, next slide, Mikala, if you perhaps are asking that same inquiry of a social scientist, their mind may initially go to, oh yeah, I actually code a lot of my qualitative data responses when I get my surveys responses back. Neither of these are incorrect definitions of the concept of coding, but if we don't clarify what we mean when we say certain actions, it could be really confusing and misleading and complicate unnecessarily the conversation that we're having with the researchers. So for this particular survey, I guess I wanted to mention there's a couple other words that come to mind for me personally as I've talked with individuals and administrators around some of these data sharing activities. So repository is one of them. If you talk to a librarian, repository is a very specific thing that offers access and preservation. If you talk to a computer scientist, they maintain many GitHub repositories and the GitHub repository may serve some of those same purposes, but it isn't necessarily talking about the same entity or the action that it takes to get the content into those. A couple other examples that come to mind for me in my work with researchers preparing data for sharing are the phrases data dictionary, code books, metadata, README, documentation. Each of those can have very specific meanings depending on the discipline that you're working with and the actions that you have to take. And so what we wanted to do with the RADS project is create a set of terminology that we could go into these discussions with the survey respondents and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. So go ahead to the next slide, Mikala. So this process was iterative. Our goal was much like what the Data Curation Network did years ago when we created a list of curation activities. We made lists. We made vocabularies. We wrote out definitions of activities related to data sharing. And we intentionally didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We acknowledge that there are a lot of glossaries and collections of terms that describe words that you'll find in our activities lists. And we did intentionally draw from them. We worked in collaboration with the Council on Governmental Relations, who created a very comprehensive matrix of roles and responsibilities and list a lot of the actions, a lot of similar actions as we did here. Once we came up with a list that we thought was the appropriate, and we tried to balance very specifically being comprehensive enough that we encapsulate the breadth of things that it takes to get ready to get research outputs ready to share. But also we wanted it to be useful and, quite frankly, not overwhelming for people who would respond to our survey. So we also acknowledge that the audiences for these different communities, PEACE and NCDS's communities around medical sciences, COGR working with university administrators, and the RADS communities and the curator communities are all going to be different. So all of those things were taken into consideration as we developed our list. When we came up with our version 1 list, we included, you'll see in the links that Alicia shared, the early version of it included some example activities with it, and not just activities, but tasks that represent those activities. Ultimately, those were removed from the final version of the list, but you may find those early lists useful if you want some specificity. And then really importantly is we took this to the community. We took it, shared it via the ARL website. We did webinars about it. We asked for feedback and got some great feedback from specifically the research data access and preservation community, and got kind of hands-on feedback of how we communicate this, what people think need to be included, and in which phase, which takes me to the next slide. Actually, not the next slide yet. Sorry, it is this slide, but I didn't get to the phases yet. My apologies. I wanted to share first before we get to the phases. Go ahead, Mikala. My apologies. Don't mean to make anyone seasick here. Here are some examples of the activities in what is our current version of the activity list. And you can see that we created a set of terminology that would resonate with researchers, as you can see in the left in the blue, as well as with people that are providing services, often university administrators, research service providers, and we're going to refer to that as institutional activities. And in many cases, the activities were very similar, but one key difference is that institutional lists, the items as worded on the right-hand side of your screen in red, were mostly done in support of data sharing. So for example, go ahead, Mikala, one more click for me. If you look at the fourth box down now, for researchers, part of the process is to determine a realistic, useful storage solution during the active phase of sharing their research data. And they do that individually, but they do it with the support of those who have developed, built, or are providing or making recommendations on those storage solutions. So the subtleties are different, but we felt it was important that each individual survey group in our work that we did here could see themselves in the way that we worded these definitions. Okay, now the next slide, which gets into the idea that we ended up with 27 of these activities in the final version that was used in the survey. And 27 is a lot. It can be a little overwhelming. So we found that it was useful to categorize these into phases of the process. These are the 5 phases, and it provides hopefully a simpler framework and hopefully less overwhelming way to think about these activities. These phases roughly comprehend to phases of a research or grant life cycle. They're presented here linearly. We acknowledge that work in doing this work is not necessarily linear. It can go back and forth. And as a matter of fact, many of the activities that you'll see in these activity lists happen throughout the life cycle, and you're going to see them presented in our documentation as the first time it would be useful for someone to think about that in the course of the process. There is one exception to that, and you're going to see in the activity list the idea of education and training being important. And we did insert that throughout multiple phases of the process, because the way you do that education, the communities that you do that education to may differ depending on what phase of the process or life cycle you're in. Next slide. So we first looked at support for these data management and sharing activities within institutions as reported by the administrative respondents to our survey. For each institution, We calculated the percentage of units or offices that supported each activity. And then we took the average of those respondents across all of the institutions. And that's presented here in this graph. The individual bars are the activities that were identified in those earlier reports. And the color coding here is associated with the phase of the project. And what you see here is the average percentage of offices at our participating institutions, plus or minus a standard error. So what we found was that institutions provided support for nearly all or for all data management activities that we inquired about, with the largest proportion of offices providing support for those in the planning, design, and startup phase of the process. And that was, you can see some of the big ones here: support for reviewing data management and sharing plans. That's an average of about 48%. Support for data collection, storage, and management activities, the next block down, was about 44%. And data retention, preservation, and preservation activities are about 40 and 41%, as well as active storage collection and management activities. But across the board, we see that institutions are providing support for these activities. So if we go to the next slide, which shows the second pool of respondents, which is researchers. And you can see here is that they did these activities, but they were not frequently engaging with the support that was provided by their institution. So this slide has back-to-back graphs for each activity, again, color-coded by phase, but it shows the average percent of researchers who completed the activities on the left-hand side versus those who did the activities on their own or within their own lab on the right-hand side. There's a noticeable difference in the size of these bars, with many more researchers completing data management and sharing activities on their own or within their lab than those who do it with institutional support. And notably, this is true even for activities that we knew within our institutions we provided pretty robust support, such as support for data management, review and consultations around data management and sharing plans. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia.
Yes, great, thanks. So one of the things we asked about, in addition to asking about what kind of activities they did, was also how much it cost. And we felt it was really important to start the conversation with those specific activities. So both administrators and researchers would have a better response or knowledge of what we mean when we're saying data management and sharing. Well, we mean those specific actions that you just responded about. Thinking about those, how much did it cost to implement those if you're a researcher, or support those if you're an institutional office or administrator? And so this first graph is about institutional offices. And so we asked about cost, both in terms of staff time or labor, like who is supporting these activities, if they're doing consultation or other kinds of human labor, and how much are you spending on the infrastructure side? So in terms of hardware or software, other kind of things you're purchasing. And so here we have all the offices, and we have split them into 4 categories. So our 4 units we have here, and I'm sorry, it's a little bit hard to read on the vertical axis, but these are research offices. So things like sponsored projects or the Office of Vice Presidents for Research, IRBs, things like that, that might review grants, libraries, IT and computing units. So this might include research computing as well as central and departmental IT offices. And then institutes and centers are on the bottom. And so these are other pockets of independent research support or research offices that support more than one project around campus. And provide kind of unit or collegiate level support. And so in looking at this, we have the total annual data management and sharing cost. So how much does it cost, both in terms of people support and in terms of infrastructure support for the year. And we asked about 21, 22 in this data. And so as you can see from these bars, the libraries and IT had the largest total DMS expenses. And this makes a lot of sense. This is in line with other findings from Koger that were more forward-looking about where they think the biggest burden or increased cost is going to land. And libraries and IT were also two of the main groups who are going to be supporting a lot of the sharing and new requirements and new services that are going to be needed with future data sharing requirements. Okay, so going on to the next slide, we also so that's on the infrastructure side, who's providing these services institutionally, how much is this costing? But the other person who is paying for data management sharing is the individual researcher for a given project. Now, Shawna mentioned at the beginning that often researchers aren't budgeting for this, thinking forward, but when we ask about how much it costs, who is doing this work that we talk about in the activities, how much are you spending in infrastructure for these kinds of activities, people are spending money on it. We do have people who are curating the data, who are managing the data, who are submitting it to repositories in a research project. And so when we look across our entire sample of researchers, who responded with financial information, we saw that the average per funded project cost to researchers was about $30,000 for data management sharing. And one way we were interested in looking at this is as a percentage of their overall costs. And this is helpful towards budgeting or having guidelines for future studies. And so when we looked across all of our researchers and their grants, on average, this was about 6% of their total grant award went to data management and sharing. And as you might suspect, the standard deviation or variability in these numbers was very large. So if you hit the next slide, Mikala. One way we wanted to look at this was by size of the award. And so our sample was primarily NIH researchers who responded. And as you can see at the top, those awards are substantially higher on average than our NSF awards. So we had 56 NIH researchers, 32 NSF research. We actually only had 3 people who responded from DOE, so we haven't included them broken out separately. But one of the things we were interested in is whether data management sharing costs would differ for those different size awards. So for each of those groups, we split the sample into those grant awards that were the smallest. So that's that lower 25%. These are the smaller awards. You can see the minimum and maximum on that chart. The middle 50%, so this is the mid 50% of awards on average, and then the upper 75th percentile of awards. So these are the largest rewards in our sample. And so keep these in mind for the next few graphs I'm going to show you. So let's move on. So this is looking again at that $29,800 number on overall DMS expenses, but now broken out by both the funder and those award percentiles. So as you can see, as expected, NIH data management sharing costs were slightly higher on average than NSF costs. And those larger grants were spending more than the smaller grants. And this pattern was true across both NIH and NSF. I've got a dotted line showing that overall global sample average on this graph. What's interesting is if we look at this in terms of percent, and so on the next slide, even though the larger grants were spending more dollar amount in data management and sharing, when we look at that dollar amount as a percentage of their total grant, it's actually much smaller for those larger grants for both NIH and NSF than it is for their counterparts who have smaller grants, but still need to do the same kind of data management and sharing work. And so overall, on average, it was 6% across our sample. Is actually 5.8, so slightly lower than 6%, but rounds up. Again, slightly lower percentage-wise for NIH grants, slightly higher for NSF, but what was startling to us is how much higher that is for the lowest range of grants. So for people in grants in that lower 25th percentile, both in NIH, but particularly for NSF, who had the lower smaller grants in the sample, the amount they're spending on data management and sharing to meet these requirements is huge compared to their overall grant. So this was a place where, you know, and we'll talk about in a little bit, but potentially institutional support are thinking about what kind of services are offered at the institution. How can we help offset those smaller awards to help them meet requirements? So go ahead. So one other thing we were interested in, so we asked about sharing and activities that people did in their work, both to help them think about what we're talking about when we are anticipating a cost, but we also were interested in, as Wendy alluded to, when we asked researchers, did you do it? We asked them not only did you do it, but did you do it on your own, meaning it was done within lab, you didn't seek any outside help? Did you do it with institutional support, which is meaning you went to some of these offices that we talked to and you got consultation from a librarian on your data management plan, or you talked with your IT office on the best places to be securing your research data, or to a librarian or archivist about where to put your data for sharing, which repository to use. Or do you turn to external support? So this would be like an agency, like their NIH IO, like an external repository. They sought for help on what should I include in my informed consent if I'm sharing with the qualitative data repository, et cetera. And so one of the things we're interested in is for each activity, they either did on their own or with external support or institutional support. How many of those activities did that affect how much they reported spending on data management and sharing? And so only one of these comparisons was significant, and that was the fact that for every activity they did on their own, so without institutional support, without external support, the amount they spend on their data management sharing increased. And so just thinking about the regression coefficient, what this meant for every extra activity they did on their own in-house, that was an increase in total cost of about $2,700 for data management and sharing. And so it is interesting and tempting to look at the slopes, and we see the institutional slope is actually in the opposite direction. That relationship wasn't significant, but also a lot of people weren't making use of institutional support. So this is definitely a place where we can only speculate at potential cost savings for having people use more institutional support, but certainly a potential here. So next slide. The last thing I wanted to highlight is how research teams were staffing people to help with their data management and sharing. So this is one piece we collected as part of the costing data. So we asked who was doing the work and how much effort they were doing, the percent effort, and then looking at salaries to calculate that total cost. And so here we asked that, and we've represented it on the vertical axis as full-time equivalent, with one being, I have a person, a data manager whose full-time job, or more than one, is data management. And so whether research teams had that, versus at the bottom, less than a quarter time. And as you can see from the bar, that very lowest bar is by far the most common. Most researchers reported that their teams or collaborators, the people doing data management for their projects, are doing it at less than 0.25% of their time, or a quarter of their time. And so this means that there is a lot of individuals doing data management sharing infrequently, or as a small part of the other things they're doing. And I think here there's potential for us as, you know, librarians or other kinds of research support providers to really help connect and make a, you know, help reach out and provide some guidance to those folks who may not be doing this full time. So I thought that was an interesting piece of our findings as well. Okay, next slide. And I think I'm going to hand it over, speaking of people and doing data management, to Mikala to talk about Data Curation Network.
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. And we only have a couple more minutes left. So as Peace put in the chat, feel free to add any questions to the Q&A because we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So to round out the discussion of RADS 1 and look forward to RADS 2, I wanted to provide a little more context about where we are coming from. So while the research project is based at the Association of Research Libraries, the Data Curation Network, or the DCN, is a key partner in this project. If you haven't heard of the DCN yet, welcome. But what we are is a community of practitioners who value learning from one another. We are a shared network of curators who address common challenges most frequently through what we call peer comparisons. This is where we take the chance to sit down and learn what we are doing at our institutions. Things like, how are you handling preservation? What are you doing with regards to metadata standards? It's a chance for us to really be clear on what we're doing, what our challenges are, and how others can learn from this, or how we can work together to find a solution. We know that this makes us stronger institutionally and makes us more prepared to handle challenges that arise. I did want to highlight that all RADS 1 members are also DCN members, and as part of RADS 2, we will have some institutions joining both the DCN and the RADS research project. So we're very excited to continue this work and to continue having this chance to explore and compare how we're handling the costing data in particular. In that vein, a few weeks ago, in our shared Slack workspace, our principal investigator, Cynthia Hudson-Vitale, asked how our members, the DCN members, were using the information presented in the RADS expense report. And we heard back some really interesting things. Now, of course, I haven't shared them verbatim here, but I wanted to highlight that many of the curators in the DCN are using the RADS expense report in their DMP consultations. So they're using this as information when researchers come to them to say, you need to budget for these things. It's more expensive if you try and do it on your own. Here's how the library can help you. Our colleagues have also used the RADS expense report to advocate for a full-time employee. If memory serves, this was in particularly in response to the needs for data management and sharing plans. But how cool is that? They were able to advocate for a full-time employee. I was so happy for them. But another way that it's being used is to consider the sharing and preservation costs that researchers are currently bearing, and also how we as libraries bear those costs too. And lastly, another common thread of how folks were using the RADS expense report was to inform their grant support model. This one is definitely still a little more nebulous, but thinking about how personnel can be written into grants in order to not only serve the researchers, but also to make sure that it's clear that the data is being supported throughout the life cycle. Like I mentioned, the second phase of RADS will see some new institutions joining the project as well as the DCN. And we're really excited to see, with a new batch of data, that we will be better informed and we can think more about how to advocate for ways in which we do this work sustainably. And when I say that, I mean both sustainably financially as well as for our own mental health. Like, I'm thinking a lot about that, advocating for a full-time employee and how that just lightens the load for everybody. I won't belabor that point, but I did want to end by noting, in my section, by noting that some costs are easier to identify than others. So it's much easier easier in some ways, to write in the cost of a repository deposit process. That's a one-time fee that happens for this data set, and many repositories that charge costs will often have something on their website that says, $20 per gigabyte or something. It's not that low. But then you can just write that into your plan. That's much easier than disentangling the costs when they kind of go across the research lifecycle. For example, if every Friday a researcher sits down and cleans out their hard drive, that's good data management. That is a cost, but it's much harder to quantify and to capture that than it is a one-time storage cost or a repository fee. We were talking about this yesterday, and I think we're kind of still teasing it out, but we also recognize that it's harder to disentangle the costs of what's good science versus what's data management. Like Shawna mentioned at the start of the webinar, they really are a circle. Good science and data management have to go hand in hand, and yet now we're trying to pull them apart. And so we're just thinking a lot about the invisible labor, maybe it's just me, thinking a lot about the invisible labor in research that's just hard to capture and quantify and put a dollar sign on. And with that, I will end my little TED Talk and turn it over to, is it Wendy or Alicia?
It's me. Yeah. So thanks, Mikala. And so one of the pieces is takeaway, and some of the things we wanted to share on this webinar are the real tips. So what do we do with this information when the rubber meets the road. And so one of the things I want to share is how I've used this information to think about how I talk with researchers about budgeting for data management sharing. And so before I get into it, I just want to qualify all of this with the fact that this is specific to my own institution. I'm at the University of Minnesota. And it's also specific, and it might differ for all of you, because I'm also not in the library. So I am in a collegiate research support center. So I would be one of those institutes and centers in our unit graph. And so the way that some of our funding and budget models work may be different than other places at a university. But I wanted to show you some examples just to see if it was helpful to hear how we're thinking about it. So one of the things when I'm encouraging people to think about data management is about the time aspect. So this is one thing that is really hard to quantify and can be nebulous, as Mikala mentioned. But we can do it. Like you can have or estimate a percentage of time for a person. We do this all the time with grants. And so thinking about, can you designate a person on the team to have primary data management responsibility, even if it's a small percent, even if it is a shared task, 1.025% of the time for all your team members. Who's the person that's going to implement the naming scheme? Who's the person that's going to implement to make sure the right file's in the right spot? Maybe it's about having a quality control process. If you have a lot of sites bringing data in, how do you make sure all the files are aligned and how they go together correctly? So the percent of time and the number of people who are primary might depend on how complex the data project is. So for example, we work with some projects that have 3 full-time data managers because they are very large projects. We have other projects where there's a grad student who has 5% of their time as the data manager. So this really depends on the project and how large and dispersed the team is, but noting that percent time, even if it's, their budget on, all of it, this is data management can be helpful. You can also include professional data management support from an institution. So this is where we get into that gray area of what's indirect and direct costs and how that works in a different institutional model. Again, I'm in a separate college, so the way we handle indirect funds is different than some central units. But for example, we have people who are doing work for a specific project that are written in. Often this is for programming, statistical support, other kinds of things. Data management might be a piece of that. Or sometimes when we aren't specifically working on a project, but we're just helping consult on it, we might be written in an indirect way in their facilities plan. So just calling out that a grant will have some sort of guidance or mentorship in data management can be really important, not just for, accounting for the cost of it, but also just emphasizing that professional data management is a skill that people have, and projects are made better when they are coordinating with people who have this skill, even if it's done in an indirect way. Next slide. The other thing is about where they plan to share. And so the nice thing about NIH's new requirements is they do require you to pick where you're going to be sharing as you're writing your data management plan, which helps with costs. So if a repository has a fee, like Mikala said, that's an easy cost. Write that in under data management. If not, that doesn't mean that curation and doing all that stuff is free. It means that you'll be doing it in-house. And so thinking about that time to organize files, to set it up, those are all things that are time. And I think the NDA repository, the NIMH data repository, has a really nice spreadsheet on how to think about that for their repository, which is more complicated than others. Finally, the other thing I suggest to people is to think about their data and to budget more time if you have other hurdles for sharing. So things like sensitive data, qualitative data, restricted data, large data, things that are going to take more effort to make appropriate to share, things that are going to take more effort to ensure you have consent to share, things that are going to take more effort to ensure that they're preserved beyond the lifespan of the grant. So it could be trivial to store a CSV for the next 10 to 20 to 100 years, maybe, but to store, a terabyte, 15 terabytes, a petabyte of data for that long, is much less tenable. So you're going to have to think differently about that kind of data. And so some concrete steps, but also many more questions. So Wendy, I'll hand it over to you to kind of get us thinking about challenges.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. And I'm going to be somewhat short here to make sure that we have time to get to the questions. I see there are some in the Q&A box. So really this slide is meant to leave you with some thoughts about some of the things that we talked about, and what ways, what new and different, not new, but what things do we still need to address? What can make us feel like we're pushing that rock up the hill still? So we talked some about the idea of how we accommodate costs that might be incurred after an award closes out. So as we know, many funding agencies don't allow these in a budget item. So how often are those happening? How are people covering them right now? How might we as support specialists, or how might you as researchers plan ahead to ensure that you can cover those, or you have the money to cover those, even if those costs aren't being incurred at the time of the project? Alicia talked about big data and the cost of big data and implications around that. That begs me to think about the fact, do we really need to keep all data all the time forever? And as a librarian, my gut instinct is yes, what if we need it? But I think we as professionals need to think about whether or not that is the reality, and how do we evaluate for data being deaccessioned? Is that something that we should start writing into plans and start thinking about earlier in the process? And who does that decision making, and what does it take to get to that point of deaccessioning? Finally, you heard this at the beginning from Shawna, in the middle from Mikala, but we want to really drive home the fact that we think it's critical that we start addressing any residual mindset that is out there that might be still thinking about data management as a separate entity. And how can we, in the words that we use and the actions that we take to describe the work that we do, stop separating these out as something completely different that we do that's on top of doing good science and really being a fundamental part of doing the research that we want to do. So with that, I think the next slide has some contact information for you. If you don't get a chance to answer your question, please feel free to reach out to us. And there's a link for more information on the RADS project at the bottom of this slide.
Okay, it looks like Alicia has been answering some questions already. Thank you, Alicia. But I would like to kind of talk about some of these as a group. So the first question that I'm seeing here is, I'm very curious to know if you were able to dig into these survey results, if researchers truly did all of those things on their own, or if in fact the library or other institutional support was overlooked. That's a great question. For the researcher surveys, we only did a sample of follow-up interviews with them for our first days. Sort of impossible to reach out to. I think we had about 340 respondents. We couldn't, reach out to all of them. So it is self-reporting. One of our goals in our phase 2 project, which we're doing right now, when we're working with the funded NIH researchers prospectively, we're meeting with them every quarter to talk about what they're doing, right? And so this is one of the ways that we're trying to get a lot of detail about what they're actually doing versus what they're self-reporting. Anyone else from the team want to add on to that one?
I could just say that I think that is a really valid point. Again, and it comes back to that vocabulary. Does it count as you're getting help from the library if there was instruction, for example, involved, and they came to a session about picking a data repository, but ultimately they picked that data repository themselves at their final point of sharing. And those are nuanced differences that we weren't able really to get to, even in the follow-up interviews. We tried to keep those to a decent amount of time, and there's a lot of rich information that we just weren't able to pull out because it's pretty nuanced.
Okay, we have two questions from Ying. So first, interesting project and thanks for putting the information together. Question, is the repository fee being investigated against the size of the grant research group, institutional repository versus external repository? Thank you. Short answer, no. Does anyone on the team want to talk more about that?
Yeah, I can say that this is just hard. And the reason why it's hard is a lot of repositories don't have a fee actually right now. And so in a lot of our institutional repositories don't charge a fee. So it's all the labor associated that's paid, you know, in the institutional in terms of time. And we've had a lot of discussions about how do we quantify the cost of curation at an institutional repository. And so, you know, that's a question we're asking. And I think the other thing that I struggle with personally as someone who guides people to repositories is the ones that have a scaling cost. It's unclear exactly what that cost is because it's so individualized to the projects. So I don't have a good answer for that, unfortunately. That's a good question.
Okay, I think Ying's second comment here is not so much a question, but a comment. So let's just skip that one for now and let's go to Carrie's question. I wonder what insight you might have for scaling a full-time employee or FTE for data management work at large institutions. How would the DM employee strategize which research teams to work with when there are a lot of researchers that might be interested? That's a great question. Alicia, I'm gonna give that one to you.
Yeah, no, this is a great question. Thank you for asking this, Carrie. I think this is also a tricky question and something that we've been thinking about a lot. And so I think it's one of those chicken and egg problems, right? You want to make people aware of the great services you provide, but also not too aware of the great services you provide, because then you can't actually provide them for everyone. And so one of the ways I've been really thinking about it is how to both do the work, but also be a connector of people who do the work and a train the trainer or train the person model. And so how do we, one of the things we're launching at Minnesota is like a data management network. So how do we find the individuals in the labs who are tasked with this as 25% of their job, or maybe they're the total data manager who is just hired to work on a few projects within their lab. How do we de-silo that person and then create a network where we can all learn and train together and you know, learn from people in the libraries and try to answer the questions at a huge decentralized university like Minnesota. There are a lot of offices and there are a lot of people, and the answer you get about something might be different depending on how you ask it. And so having a more central view and really taking the more mentorship training approach to grad students or staff or individuals who are doing this in the lab can be a more sustainable way. I've also thought about having a way where you are training grad students for these professional positions. So like, how do we think about the pipeline to professional curator or data management jobs? And like, can you train graduate students in this work, help them work on other projects, and eventually, you know, bring them in as demand grows? But these are all just things I'm thinking about. But I think this is going to be a really hard question, one that we're all going to be facing.
Can I quickly echo what Lena put in the chat about limiting the number of services that you are providing? We say a lot, at least me and a couple colleagues, that, you know, if you say yes to everything, then you're not doing anything well. And so you have to figure out what your strengths are and what the needs of your researchers are before you open up a can of worms that overwhelms you.
Yes.
Well, we are in our final minutes. I have posted the evaluation of our wonderful speakers. Please complete it. We utilize that data to improve what we offer. Also, if you are interested in the Medical Library Association Continuing Education Credit, complete the survey. The code is not available quite yet. They're still getting their website and their systems up and running, so there's a little bit of a delay on that, and I will provide that code to those who've completed the survey. via email later on. So please expect a follow-up from me with the materials from today and the recording, and information about the code if you complete the evaluation form. Thank you all for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.